Okay, so first thing, let's kind of go back and just review a little bit, make sure everybody remembers. I think we talked about these. We'll go back just to make sure everybody's still on the same base here. Okay, domain and range. If you do or don't remember, domain was your x values, and your range is going to be your y values. Okay, and I know we practice on interval notation and other stuff on these. So when we talk about graphs, which is where we're going with this next part that we're looking at, that for graphs, we're going to use interval notation. To describe the domain and range. Okay, because if not, it gets really hard to talk about those in some cases. So that's why we're kind of using interval notation. Is now we're going from just having a few numbers to having lots and lots and lots of numbers that we're going to talk about with domain and range on those. Okay, and the x-intercept. I can't remember if we talked about these or not. But when we talk about what the x-intercept is, that's where the graph crosses the x-axis. Crosses, I guess the technical word there is intersects. So where a graph intersects the x-axis. Okay, now that's if you're looking at a graph, it's pretty easy to find it because you just look at it and go, okay, there's where it hits the x-axis. You tell me that point, whether it's 2, 0 or 5, 0 or negative 4, 0, whatever. If they give you an equation, you have to plug in y equals 0 and then solve. Okay, so if they don't give you a graph, because again, if they give you a graph, it's really easy to look at it and find it what it is. But if they give you an equation and they ask you what's the x-intercept, you plug in 0 for the y value and then you solve that for x from there. Okay, y-intercepts. It's the exact same thing for y-intercepts. It's just we're going to change up the x and the y values. So when we talk about what the y-intercept is, um, that's where the graph intersects the y-axis. Okay, and the same thing for equations. You plug in x equals 0. And then you solve for y. Okay, so again, exact same thing. It's just one time you plug in 0 for x to get the y-intercept. To get the x-intercept, you plug in 0 for y. Okay, and then after they do a little bit with x-intercepts and y-intercepts, they're going to talk about maximum and minimum value. Maximum value, again, it's still the highest point on a graph, but the most important thing in this case is it's the y value. of the highest point on the graph. Okay, and then we talk about the minimum value. It's still the minimum value, still the y value in this case. Of the lowest point on the graph. Okay, and then here's where they throw in a couple of things that kind of tie in with slope, but it's not exactly slope. We'll get there. So when we're looking at graphs, we've got increasing values, and basically this is where you got a graph that rises, and then basically you got to think about this is like when they're talking about increasing values, that's where you have a positive slope. Okay, now when you're finding increasing values, it's really easy to look at the graph and look at it and go, oh, okay, well, I know that's increasing. The hard part is when you describe it, because the hard part on this is when you talk about the things that's here, you have to describe using the x values, which is your domain. And that's the part that gets a little tougher because it's really easy to find out where it's increasing because you can look at it and go, oh, that's where it's increasing. But when you actually describe it, that's the part that gets a little tougher. And that's the part we got to work on today. That's easy to find it. It's just, again, when we describe it, that's the part that gets a little tougher when it comes off of it. Okay, for decreasing values. Okay, so for decreasing values, well, if increasing is where you've got a positive slope, decreasing, that's where you're going to have a graph that falls where you got a negative slope. Okay, the same thing when we describe it, it's going to be using the x values to describe it. So that part's going to be the same way as we go through that one. And there's one other option we've got here where you have constant values. And that's basically where your graph is horizontal. Okay. And then same thing, you're going to describe these using the x values. Again, it's easy to find it. It's just describing them that gets a little bit tougher as we go through some of those. So. Okay. All right. Now, and one other thing they kind of use to tie in with this one, it's a little different. It's different set, but we're still kind of along that same idea, same thought process as we're going through these. Is one other thing they're going to talk about is where they talk about something being interval positive. And where they talk about where the interval is positive, this is where the graph is above the x-axis. And if you got an interval positive, you're also going to have an interval negative. So if positive is above the x-axis, negative is going to be where the graph is below the x-axis. Okay, and just like on this part back up here, where we're going to use the domain to describe it, for both of these, we're going to do the same thing, is that you've got to use the domain to describe it. And again, that's the part that's not, it's not really hard, it's just tricky, and it takes a little bit to kind of get used to it, to talk about it, because again, finding out where something is positive slope or negative slope or horizontal line, that part's really easy to find. It's just when you talk about it the way that it needs to be talked about, that's the part that gets a little bit tougher as you go through those. Okay, now here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that graph paper that you've got, and we're going to go through that one and kind of dig through that with everything that's here. So we're going to go back through and answer some questions, and we're actually going to answer more than what's on there, because there's a lot more to this one that we could do than what's on here. All right, everybody good? Everybody still copying that one down? All right, we'll pause for just a minute. Let everybody get caught up here. All right, so here's what we're going to do. On that graph paper that you've got here, with the paper with the graphs on it, we're going to go back and answer these questions and just kind of walk through this one and see what we can do. And again, we'll show you how easy it is to find some of this stuff. It's describing it. That's the harder part that's going to take a little bit of work on this. Okay, so it says on this given graph that's below here, it says on what interval is f of x increasing? So where is there a positive slope on this thing? On the left side or the right side? All right. So now if you start on the left, we're going up on this side, correct? So we're going up till we get here. So this green part would be positive. So I'm kind of black on the screen there, but that's going to be the positive part that we're looking at. So if that part is positive, once you get to the top, this part's headed down. So then that part's going to be negative. Okay, so most people go, okay, well, I can see it now. All right, so I'm going up over here. I'm going down over here. So this part's going to be positive. And then this part's going to be negative. Okay, so finding, again, if you look at it and figure it out, finding that part's pretty easy. Describing it's going to be a little bit tougher. So when we describe it, we're not going to look up and down. We got to look left and right. So again, when we're describing these, we've got to look at it from describing the x values, which is our domain. So basically on this part of it, how far to the left can we go on this thing? Or do we ever stop? We don't ever stop, right? Because this got the arrow says it keeps going forever. Now it's going forever down. But if you keep going, it keeps going forever and ever and ever. If we keep pulling the paper down, it's still going to keep going. And it still keeps eventually moving out to the left. So when we describe this thing, where that it's got this part of it's increasing on this first part right here, we're going to say that it's increasing from negative infinity, and then it's going to stop when we get to this point that's right here, and that point is at 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's at 0, 4. So we're going to stop at this point, but again, when we describe it, we're not going to, even though we're stopping at the top here at 4, we're actually going to talk about just the x values. We're going to say that's negative infinity to 0 for increasing. All right, and out beside that, if you want to, go ahead and put decreasing. I don't know why that wasn't on here. Just found this one, and this was kind of good so we could see it. So that's the interval that's increasing. We're also going to do the interval that's decreasing. So at this point, we're going to start here, and we're going down basically forever. So if you think about if you could put a point over here at the very end of this part, the x value is going to be infinity. it's going down forever. So that if we could graph this point, if like the last point on the graph, it'd be infinity, negative infinity, because we're going forever this way. But then the y value is getting smaller, so it's going to be that one. So when I ask for interval decreasing, again, we're going to, even though we're looking up and down, you got to talk about it left and right. So we're going to start at 0, and then we're going to go to infinity. Okay, and again, it's easy to find it because it's, oh, that's positive, because if I start over here, I'm going up here, and I'm going down here. But again, describing it, that's the part that gets a little tougher, because it's a little tougher to kind of describe those. And this graph is kind of sort of like, anybody been to the Space and Rocket Center, read the slingshot out there, or the moonshot? Slingshot. I think it's a slingshot, right? And then what they call it, where you get in at the bottom and it just shoots you up to the top. And then once you're at the top, you float for like a split second, where you're up off the seat. You're not, the shoulder harness isn't pulling you down yet. And then for just a split second, you're kind of floating, and then all of a sudden it grabs you and pulls you back down. And that's kind of what this 0.04 is. It's at the top of the graph. It's not really increasing. It's not decreasing. This is where you float for just a split second for this thing. Because that's why, if you remember, that's why we don't use the square brackets, because 0, this point it's not really increasing. It's not decreasing. It's that split second where you kind of float for just a split second. So when we use these zeros, we're not going to use brackets on those. We're just going to use the parentheses there. Okay, so that's the first one. We're talking about increasing and decreasing on this part of it. Okay, where it's positive, basically it's saying this, that if we're talking about where this thing is positive, that's everything that's above the x-axis. So we're just going to cover up everything that's negative on this part of it. So they ask, where is this thing positive? Well, cover up everything below the x-axis. That part of the graph is where it's going to be positive. Okay, now when we're describing, I'm going to bring this down here so we can answer this one. So where it's positive is that part of the graph, but again, you got to talk about the points from left to right. So here's where you write down the leftmost point right here, and that was what, at negative 20? Made my graph really big, so I may have messed it up there. Yeah, so that point right there is at negative 20. This point right here is at 20. So when I ask you where is it positive, we know that part of the graph is positive, so that's a little arc up here. But again, when you describe it, that's where we're going to go from negative 2, which is this point on the left, to positive 2, which is that point on the right. Okay, so we're talking about where it's positive. We're also going to talk about the interval where it's negative. So again, if that's the part where it's positive, when we talk about where it's negative, well, it's just the opposite, right? That's everything that's down here. Now, it's still got these same two stopping points that's here. So that point that's at negative 20 is this point. That point's at positive 20. So that's basically where we're kind of having this thing negative. So this part of the graph over here is negative, and this part of the graph over here is negative. So there's actually two parts where it's negative. Again, if you could graph this point all the way to the end, this would be negative infinity, negative infinity. So this little chunk of the graph here starts at negative infinity, and it goes till we stop at this point, which is at negative 2. Okay, and then we're going to do a U for union, because then it kind of jumps over to this point over here that's at 20. And it goes down to this point, which is infinity, negative infinity. But again, we're only going to use the x values, so it's 2 out to infinity. Okay, so again, easy to find. There's the positive part. That's everything above the x-axis. There's the negative part. That's everything that's below the x-axis. To find it is easy. To describe it, that's the part that gets a little bit tougher as you go through this one. Okay, now one thing we'll do here. They didn't ask for it, but we're going to do this one as well. X-intercept and y-intercept. Okay, so x-intercept, that's where it's crossing the x-axis. There's actually two. You got this one that's at negative 20, and you also have it at 20. So sometimes you'll have more than one x-intercept or more than one y-intercept. For the y-intercept in this case, there's only that one point at the top there that would be at 0, 4. Okay, now, and one other thing they didn't ask for that we're going to go ahead and put on this one just so we've got everything that's here. They should ask you, there shouldn't be a max and a min on the same question. So if this point 0, 4, okay, this is at the top of the graph, then that should be the maximum point. So when they ask about the max value, again, it's just the y number. So in that case, it would be 4. Okay, now if they ask about the maximum point, then the point 0.04 would be the maximum point. But if they ask for just the max value, that's at 4. So you have to kind of, sometimes they'll ask for the value, sometimes they ask for the point. So again, if they ask for the max point, that's at 0, 4. If they just say max value, that should just be 4. And sometimes they'll kind of go back and forth on those. Now, if this is the first test, if we're doing this one, if I ask you for, this one and you give me this, I'll still take that answer. So as long as you've got either one of those two, that should be fine. But Math Excel, they get really picky about how they want the answer. So if it's max point, you got to put 0, 4. If it's just the max value, you just put the 4 that's there. All right. All right, so 14. Basically, we're going to do the same thing on this one. Now, 14's got a little bit of a spot on this one. We'll show you what it is and kind of figure out what's happening with it. But anyway, we'll go through this one and see what we got here. So we've got decreasing first. So again, if we talk about where it's decreasing, that's basically a negative slope. So if we talk about where the line's going down, well, that's, again, you find it, there's that one, and there's that one. So we got two parts where it's decreasing. Okay, again, easy to find, a little tougher to describe it in this case. So basically, you go back and tell me, all right, if I go on this thing forever, what's that point going to be back here forever? All right, so we got negative infinity, and then it's going up to positive, because again, it's going up, so that answer would be at infinity. Okay, and then find that, so that's the last point, if you want to talk about it that way. That's the last point over on this point graph over here somewhere. And then you got to tell me, all right, where does this thing stop? That stops right here at this point. That's at negative 3, 0. So it asks, where's it decreasing? If you can write down the 2 points, you've got it. Because again, just use the x values. It's negative infinity to negative 3. And then we're going to jump to this section, so that's when we put the u in there. And then we'll do the same thing. Tell me what the leftmost point is right here. Well, that point is at, somebody started to say it there, 0, 3. This point right here is at 3, 0. And again, when you describe, again, even though we're looking up and down, you got to talk about the x value. So this one on the left is 0. This one on the right is 3. So for that one, when it talks about the interval decreasing, it's from 0 to 3. So 2 parts where it's decreasing, so 2 answers when I talk about where it's decreasing. Okay, so we've got increasing, or we've got decreasing. We're going to do increasing as well. Well, that'll be the other 2 parts, right? So it's going to be increasing from, which is positive slope. That's from here to here, and from here to here. Okay, so again, if you've got it kind of laid out here, here's what we'll do. Again, increasing, it goes from this point to this point, so we're going to talk about the x values. So that's negative 3 to 0. Okay, and now if we go find out what this last point would be over here, that one's going out to infinity. It's going up to positive infinity, so this one would be infinity, infinity. If you're a Whataburger fan, there's your W for your Whataburger. 2 parts. So here's the second part. Starts at 3, goes up to infinity. Okay, so again, there's the decreasing part where it's going down. There's the increasing part where it's going up. And again, if you can just name the points, just tell me the x values from -3 to 0 for the increasing, and then 3 to infinity for that part. All right, now here's the part where I think they kind of messed up on this one a little bit. We'll kind of show you. All right, so where it's positive, that's everything above the x-axis, right? Okay, that's almost the whole graph, right? But the only thing that's going to be not on that graph is these 2 points right here, because again, if you look at where it's positive, where it's got to be above the x-axis, these are points are on 0. And 0 is not positive, right? 0 is not negative. It's that in between. So in this case, then we're going to basically kind of do this in a bunch of different parts. And I don't think this is, when I looked at the answer for this question from where I grabbed this sample, they did it wrong. They did this one the wrong way, because they just put, here's what answer they wanted you to have. And don't write this down because this is not the right answer. They wanted you to say it was negative infinity to infinity, where it was like this number was, so the whole graph they're saying was above the x-axis. But it's not, because again, those 2 points are on the x-axis, so you have to kind of leave those points out. They should have basically just had like an open circle here. If they had open circles, then we could have said, yeah, it's negative infinity to infinity, and we would have skipped around the 3 and the -3 because that was messing up. So that's the answer they wanted, but that's not the correct answer. So here's what the correct answer is going to be. So basically, it's everything except for those 2 points. So it's going to be negative infinity to -3. We're going to skip over the -3. And to here, we're good. Down to here, we're good. So we've got to skip over that number at 3, because again, those 2 points are out. And then we're going to go 3 to infinity. Again, I know that they wanted it to be negative infinity to infinity. They just did not draw it the right way for it to be that way. They would have had to scooted this thing up just a little bit. And those points hit the x-axis. So technically, they're not positive. They're not negative. They're just 0. So they're not either one of those 2 things. They're just in between there. Okay. Now, this is one they shouldn't ask you for a max value, because if you go, you can go up forever. So if they did ask you for a max value, it'd be infinity. They can ask you for a minimum value. Okay, so what's the low point on the graph? Yeah, got 2, right? It could be this point or it could be this point, because they're both at the same part. But again, all we're worried about is the y value, and the y value in both of those is 0. So our minimum value in that case would be 0. So that's one where, again, it's kind of a tie, because they're both low points, so we can use them both there. Okay. Oh, let's get the other things here we can get. The x-intercepts. Got 2, right? Because you got -3, 0, and 3, 0, because both of those are hitting the x-axis. And as far as the y-intercept goes, there's one number here. That'd be at 0, 3. Okay, so hopefully it's starting to make a little bit more sense as we're going through these. Because again, the first time it's like, I'm not so sure. Second time it starts to get a little better. Hopefully by the time we do this third one, it'll be even better. That it'll finally get to lock in on this one for what we're looking at. So. Okay, so again, probably the easiest thing to do is let's go back and figure out what these points would be. So if you kept going forever this way, the x value would be negative infinity. It's going down forever, so that point would also be negative infinity. We're going up this way, then this point would be at 0, 2. Where this point is at what, 3, 2. So basically, anywhere where it kind of changes direction, you almost will write those points down. We got another one that changes here. That's at 4, 5, 6, negative 4. All right, and then when it goes forever, that's infinity, but it doesn't go any up or down. So this one, when it keeps going forever, it's still going to be at negative 4. So it's going to be 10, negative 4, 11, negative 4, 12, 13. So no matter what we do, even if we go out to infinity, that y value never changes at negative 4. Okay, so that's really the points that we're working with on this thing as we're going through this one. So the very first thing it asks us, it says, where is this thing constant? And again, constant, that's your horizontal lines. So that's here and also there. All right, so when we do that one, again, we're going to talk about just the x value. So that's from 0 to 3. And then this part is also horizontal, so that's going to go from 6 out to infinity. Okay, so we talk about increasing. That's where the line's going up. So if we start on the left, that one's going up, so that would be the increasing part. I'm going to put this one underneath here. So increasing, that's this part of the graph. Again, the x value is negative infinity. When we get here, that x value is at 0. And decreasing, that's where the graph is going down. Or we got a negative slope. That'd be that section right in there. Okay, so that starts at 3 and then goes to 6. Okay, so again, it might be helpful when you get these, just to every time the graph makes a change of some kind or another, just write down what those points are, and that way that should kind of help you figure out what you got to do. Because again, if you've got the points written out, it's easy just to pull the x values out of it there. All right, graph asks where it's negative. Well, that's everything down here. So it's negative from here to here, and it's negative from here to here. The only thing we don't have is these 2 points right here. So if we write that out, that's at what, negative 2, 0. This one is at 4, 0. So where it talks about negative, let's put that right here. Again, that's the part of the graph that's negative. So it goes from negative infinity up to negative 2. And then it jumps over to here, and it goes from 4 out to infinity. Okay, so we need everything below the graph, but again, we're only going to use the x values to talk about it. Okay, so that's everything negative. Everything positive is everything up here. So that's everything from here to here. Now, again, we kind of covered this one up, but again, we need this point, which was at negative 2, all the way over to here, which was at 4. So where it's positive, it's going to be from negative 2 to 4. Okay, so we've got increasing, decreasing, constant. We've got the positive. We've got the negative. The only thing, the maximum values. Okay, now again, there's not a maximum point, but we do have a max value because basically we've got, this will be like a tie for all these points, but the one thing they all have in common is the y value is 2, so the max value would be 2. Let's see, x-intercepts crosses x-axis there and there. So it's a negative 2, 0, and 4, 0. I think in Math Excel, they always say just put a comma between those two. So if you've got multiple answers, you put a comma in between them. And then y-intercept will be just that one number there that's at 0, 2. Okay. Oh, now here's one thing we didn't do on these. We'll back up and kind of do this for all these problems because we didn't really do this. If we talk about domain and range on these, I'm gonna put these in red over on the side over here. This will be the last thing we'll do with these graphs, just to kind of tie this thing in. So when we talk about domain, that's our x values. What's the x value, the point all the way on the left? Well, this is our leftmost point, right? So if we start talking about domain and range, domain is you're going to use your x value, so that's going to be negative infinity. And then you go to the very rightmost point here. And you tell me what that x value is. That's negative infinity to infinity. All right. When you talk about range, now we're switching and going back to the y values. Range is you tell me the lowest point on the graph, because that's left to right. Range is you're going from low to high. So what's the lowest point on the graph? Well, also going to be this one, right? Because that's our leftmost point. It's also the lowest. Now again, when you talk about range, you talk about the y values. So for the range on this one, that's going to be negative infinity. And then you go to the high point, which again, we know that's a max value. That's up here. And that's where you tell me what's the y value there. Well, that's going to be 2. Now, in this case, this is one time because we've got all these points for the max value. We actually get there. So when we talk about the range, we actually get to use a bracket on that one because we actually get to use the 2 because they're all the high points on that one. Everything else over here that we're using, all this other stuff, it's always going to be brackets. But if we talk about the range, unless it's an open circle, it should be a square bracket on that one. Okay, then we'll back up and do the same thing for these two back up here. Just make sure we got it. So when we talk about domain on this one, again, you go to the leftmost point, which was this point. Tell me the x value. You go to your rightmost point. Tell me the x value. And there you go. So it goes from negative infinity to infinity. Okay, when we talk about range, we're going from low to high. All right, low point on the graph. Either one of these two, right? But again, range is always your y values. They're both the same answer, so that's 0. And so they both have it, so we can actually use that one. So we'll actually put a square bracket there. And in your highest point, could be this one or this one, right? But if you look at it, both y values are infinity. So this thing is going from 0 to infinity. All right, and then one more up here. Okay. Point on the left, which is also a low point, is going to be negative infinity. Point on the right, which also kind of go in there. So that's negative infinity to infinity. Okay, when we go range, now we're looking low to high. 2 low points, right? Negative infinity. Both of these are your low points here. They're both negative infinity. So the range is going to be negative infinity. We know that's the high point, right? Because that's the max value. So anytime we got a max number, if we're looking up and down, that's the number it's going to be here. That's going to be a 4, and we're going to block it off. Okay, and that's the next thing we'll do when we get to the next chapter we'll actually start tying that in. If you've got the max value, that's the biggest number in your range. Where when you have the minimum value, that's the lowest number in your range. So I think here, max value, that's the biggest number in your range. So that max value or min value always ties in with your high or low number that you have in your range as you go through those.